let's get started with part 7. Now, moving on to my other favorite type of telephoto lenses, super telephoto lenses. Super telephoto lenses have super compression and super background blur. In my mind, super telephoto lenses start at 400mm and they go up from there. The longest one I'm aware of is made by Canon and it goes up to 1000mm and it has a f5.6 aperture. In theory and in principle, a super telephoto can be much longer than described. The most common type is a 400mm. The reason these are more common is they are lighter and less bulky, and they are also cheaper than the longer telephoto lenses. Once you get past 400mm, 200mm, or 300mm, these lenses become really impractical to handhold, and you have to employ a monopod or a tripod. The next most common super telephoto lens is 500mm and 600mm. These come in two different flavors, the big kind, which usually come in an f4 aperture, and the cheaper kind that come in an f5.6 aperture. The variable aperture ones are more common because they are lighter and cheaper. The f4 kind is usually found at sports events. You also see them employed with photojournalists who are tasked with photographing wildlife, or photographers who have very deep pockets filled with money. The f4 variety allows you to gather more light and have more background blur. Hiking with these f4 lenses is difficult at best. If you're the type of person who's going to be doing a lot of hiking and moving around, you should probably avoid the big f4 lenses and go with the smaller variety of the f5.6 lenses. These f4 lenses are better suited for people who are on safari, photographing in vehicles, or in blinds, as you can see in this example here. If you know the animal is going to be at a particular location, these big telephoto lenses are great. They easily make up for being big, bulky, and heavy and needing to be used with a monopod or tripod because of their big, wide maximum aperture. This fast maximum aperture easily makes up for all the disadvantages of these lenses in this situation due to the much faster maximum aperture, allowing you to gather more light and achieve a much blurrier background. Now that we're done covering super telephoto lenses, let's now talk primes versus zoom lenses. For the beginning of this video, we've been mostly looking at prime lenses. The advantage of a prime lens is that it can be cheaper and smaller than a zoom lens, but not always. But a prime lens is able to have a much wider maximum aperture than any zoom lens can. The only disadvantage is if you want to change focal length, you're going to have to change your lens. Now, moving on to the marvel of zoom lenses. A zoom lens is not a telephoto lens. The difference between a prime lens and a zoom lens can alter its focal length as well as its aperture. A prime lens can only adjust its aperture, not its focal length. This means you can have a zoom that's 16 to 35 millimeters, or you can have a zoom that's 24 to 70 millimeters, or you can have a zoom that's 70 millimeters to 200 millimeters. You can have a zoom that's over 100 millimeters to 400 millimeters, or you can have a zoom that's 100 millimeters to 500 millimeters, or a zoom that's 100 millimeters to 600 millimeters. Anything that's 16 or wider is a wide-angle zoom. A standard zoom starts anywhere from 24 millimeters to 28 millimeters to 35 millimeters, and it goes to 70 millimeters or 105 millimeters. A telephoto zoom starts at 70 millimeters or 100 millimeters and goes up to 200 millimeters or 300 millimeters. A super telephoto zoom can start at 100 millimeters and go up to 400 millimeters, or it can start at 200 millimeters and go up to 600 millimeters. Your wide angle zooms and standard zooms in telephoto zooms are able to have a wide maximum aperture of f2.8 or f4. These lenses are favored by photographers and filmmakers due to the amount of constant light they let in with their wide maximum apertures. A lot of zoom lenses, especially kit zoom lenses, tend to have variable apertures as you zoom in and out. Now, it's time to talk about the downside of using zoom lenses. The zoom lens is stuck anywhere from f4 to f2.8. Sigma does make an APS-C zoom that is f1.8, 18 to 35 millimeters. The prime lens can have f1.8 or wider. But why? A prime lens only has to do one job, be one focal length, and be able to vary its aperture. That's it. Versus a zoom lens that has to be multiple focal lengths and has to have a consistent aperture throughout those focal lengths. It is much easier to engineer a lens to be sharp when that lens only has to do one thing, be one focal length and nothing else. The zoom lens, on the other hand, has to be multiple lenses and multiple aperture openings all at once. Your zoom lens is able to achieve this amazing feat by moving different optics inside the lens around. Some it will move forwards, some it will move backwards. This is how the zoom lens is able to transform itself, which makes them much harder to build and much harder to engineer. They also tend to be much heavier due to the fact that all of those elements need to be able to move around. You also have to ensure that the light transmission stays the same. This is why a lot of cheaper zoom lenses tend to have variable apertures, and super zoom lenses also need to have variable apertures to cut down on the complexity of the lens. This is why most zooms have a constant aperture at f2.8 or f4. If they were any wider, they would be too heavy and too bulky and have poor image quality. In the future, our computer systems will get better and we'll be able to engineer zoom lenses that have much wider maximum apertures. In this century, we saw massive improvement in zoom lenses aperture openings. Not even 10 years ago, the widest maximum aperture you can get was only f2.8. As time progresses, zooms will be able to cover even wider focal length and even longer, more telephoto focal lengths as well. In the beginning of photography, all you had were prime lenses, and well into the film era, they were the only option you had. It wasn't to around the 70s, which is about the middle of the film era, that zoom lenses became an option. They didn't have a very particularly big zoom range, and they didn't have a particularly wide maximum aperture either. The image quality was not particularly good either. Get ready for part 8.